guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Dillard. He served in the very well-respected 82nd Airborne Division and is a veteran of World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Let's start at the very beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and on the 14th of September 1925, so I was a teenager when I enlisted in the Army at age 16.
So that would be 1941. Was that right after Pearl Harbor then?
Well, actually 1942, a year later.
I see. What was your reaction as a teenager when you heard the news about Pearl Harbor?
A little different for me because my stepfather was in the Army, and we lived just outside of the gates of Fort McPherson, Georgia, and he was in the only signal battalion that the Army had at that time. And they deployed to North Africa for the landing in Africa, and I just couldn't wait to go. So I was all charged up, and he had already gone. He was involved in the landing there in North Africa, and I saw these advertisements for the paratroopers, and that's what I wanted to do.
Now, enlisting at 16, was that okay then, or did you have to?
No, I had to fudge a little bit and twist my mother's arm to sign the papers because one was still supposed to be at least 18. And I knew the sergeant major that ran the recruiting office because I spent a lot of time at Fort McPherson, caddied for the officers there. It's how I learned to play golf. But the sergeant major, he knew, and he just turned his head and said, well, I guess your family knows what they're doing. So he didn't question that.
And you picked Airborne. Why'd you pick Airborne?
Well, they had a really good campaign going, and they had posters showing guys in parachutes, and it caught as a matter of fact, it caught the imagination, I think, of many of the young men because armor with the tanks and everything had been the big attraction until the paratroopers came on the scene. And once that started, they didn't have any trouble at all recruiting volunteers, and I think that the 11th Airborne Division average age of the men, not necessarily the officers in the division, was around 21. So you can see it was a very youthful group of soldiers that comprised the Army Airborne, as we now refer to it.
Where did you go to train?
Well, I went through basic training at Camp Walters, Texas. And at that point, you could volunteer for the paratroopers. That's what it was called at that time. Now we say Airborne. But instructors from Fort Benning came, and we had to go through a very strenuous physical exercise to prove that we could do as many push-ups or as many tumbles as they wanted because we were determined that we were going to go to the Airborne School. And then we went to Fort Benning. I was there in November of 1942, and several people that had served with me in basic training also were in the same class with me at Fort Benning, class of in November of 1942, and we finished that training, and then we went in what they call the frying pan at Fort Benning, and the frying pan was just an area there where you were waiting for an assignment. You finished your parachute school. You went into the holding area, which we call the frying pan, and then you were assigned to airborne units as they were activated because they were in the process of really activating the units for World War II. And in my case, there were 500 of us in the frying pan at that time, and we were all assigned to the 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion. They were shipped to Panama, and we were organized at sea. The colonel, we're about 2 days out of Norfolk, Virginia, and the colonel came on the loudspeaker system and told us that we were now part of the 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion, and we were going to Panama. And our mission in Panama was to prepare to jump on the island of Martinique because it was controlled by the Vichy French government. And the fear was that it could be used as a submarine refueling point for either German or Japanese submarines. And about 2 weeks before we were ready to jump, they changed their allegiance, the government of Martinique, to Charles de Gaulle. And that, of course, ended the need for that airborne operation. So our unit then came back through the United States at Camp McCall and did retraining rather than jungle training in Panama to European-type warfare for about 4 months before we deployed to North Africa.
And when did you deploy to North Africa?
It was April of 1943.
And what was your mission there? I know ultimately
our battalion was scheduled to go to Anzio and reinforce the effort there in Italy, but as we approached the Straits of Gibraltar, we were attacked by German aircraft. And my battalion had been split because we had 2 companies on one Liberty ship and the other companies on another Liberty ship. And the other ship was damaged by the airstrikes that the Germans were strafing the convoy. And it had to put into Gibraltar for repairs. But my ship was okay, so we went on into Algiers. And we were there for about a week until they had repaired the ship and it came to Algiers, and the battalion was united again. And then we went to Italy. Well, by that time, the mission to go to Anzio had been changed, and we were designated to go and get ready to jump into southern France for the Operation Dragoon. So we spent about 2 months, the better part of 2 months in Sicily, doing very rough physical training to get ready for the jump into southern France, which we did on the 15th of August, 1944.
What was the training consisting of?
A lot of running or jogging, if you please, particularly in the sand along the shore there, where it made it much rougher to run. And the idea there is that we will all be in splendid physical condition for the operation. And then there were a couple of amphibious landings that we participated in the event the weather changed, and rather than going in by parachute, we might have to go in on a landing craft. So it was very intensive with the physical training for us, and some marksmanship training, refresher training, if you will, because we had already completed a lot of firing of different weapons, including the bazooka, which was new to everyone, at Camp McCall, North Carolina, before we deployed to Europe. And that training came in worthwhile later after we were on the ground.
We're talking with the retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Dillard. He's a veteran of the 82nd Airborne Division. And, sir, you mentioned that Operation Dragoon launched in August of 1944. Obviously, a lot was going on in the European theater at that point. Patton's on his way to Paris within the next several days. The breakout is happening. What was the target of Operation Dragoon down there in southern France?
Well, the 7th Army, and it was comprised of units like the 3rd, 36th, and 45th Infantry Divisions from Italy, made the water landing, and we jumped 50 miles inland to block the roads leading towards the beach. And the idea was to open up a second front and go up, the 7th Army would proceed up the Rhone Valley and join up with the forces of northern France. It would also facilitate the movement of logistics supplies that were desperately needed on the northern front. And, you know, Patton was constantly restrained from moving forward because a lot of the petrol that was available was reallocated to Montgomery's force and taken away from Patton. So he just have to sit and wait for a while until they got logistical support. So there were, I think, 2 objectives. One was to open up another logistical source for northern France from Toulon and Marseille. And our airborne task force then moved along the Riviera coast to the Italian border and pushed the German forces. It was a threat from the right flank of 7th Army until the forces in Italy had moved up north of our position in France. And when that occurred, then the mission for the Airborne was finished, and we then were reallocated, or I guess you would say reassigned to 18th Airborne Corps that was then in northern France, and we loaded up on a train and were taken up to a French fort where we were there for 2 or 3 days before the Battle of Bulge happened.
Let me back up to Operation Dragoon for just a moment, because that's the first direct combat that you were involved with after roughly 2 years of training and planning for such a thing. So after all that planning and training, what was it like to actually engage the enemy?
Well, it was a relief because everybody, as you say, we had gone through a lot of training, and we felt that our unit was the best one in the Airborne or in the Army. You feel that way with your unit. And the training really paid off once we were on the ground. The second day that my battalion was on the ground in France, we captured, I think it's the only one, we captured a German Major General in his command post. And he then being debriefed, told us where the Corps Commander, Lieutenant General, was hiding out in a bunker outside of Dragoon, the city that we captured. So my company went out on patrol and surrounded the bunker. And the German general sent his aide out who could speak English. And he told our interpreter that the general could not surrender to less than another general officer. He was a lieutenant general, the German. So we outpost the bunker, and the next morning the 36th Infantry Division relieved us in that sector, and their assistant division commander, who was a brigadier general, accepted General Neuling's surrender. So we were very pleased and felt very proud of the fact that we had not only captured one major general in his office, but we had also led to the location and the capture of the Corps Commander a few miles outside of the city. So we're very elated over that, and it was just the determination and persistence that our unit had in moving forward that accomplished that.
Colonel, we're going to pause right there for a short break. When we come back, we'll head to the Battle of the Bulge. This is Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined in studio today by retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Dillard, veteran of the 82nd Airborne Division. He is also a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. During the previous segment, we talked about him joining the paratroopers in the 82nd Airborne and the training that took place, and ultimately onto Operation Dragoon, the first combat with the enemy in the European theater. And sir, you sort of set the stage a little bit earlier in the last segment about how all the elements came together for the Battle of the Bulge. When your unit heard about what was happening up in that area, where were you at the time?
When we moved up from southern France, we were garrisoned in Lyon, France, at an old French fort. And we immediately began to do training again. And we had a lot of German prisoners there that did the police and cleaning the fort of the caserne cleaned up. And we were there. We were only there for 3 or 4 days, and I was a sergeant at that time, the communications sergeant for A Company at the 551st. And the charge of quarters came around about 2 o'clock in the morning and said the company commander wants all the non-commissioned officers to come to the orderly room. So we went down there, and he then told us, he said, the Germans have broken through on the front. No one really knows where the front is, and we have to be packed and ready to leave here at 6 o'clock in the morning as soon as the trucks arrived, and we'll go up attached to the 82nd Airborne Division and see what we can do to stop the German breakthrough. And we were ready, but we had to wait almost a full day before the trucks came, and when they arrived, they were all open bed truck, 2.5 ton trucks, and the beds were full of 5-gallon jerry cans full of gasoline. So you're sitting in an open bed truck, it's sleeting and snowing, and your feet and legs are stretched out over these 5-gallon gasoline cans. So anything could have happened if a round had hit those gasoline cans. But anyway, we drove into Belgium, and as we approached one town there, March and Hotten, the German SS had already crossed the creek on the other side of the village, and they were coming into town. So they had to turn our convoy around and take a circuitous route up to Bourbourg, where the 82nd Airborne Division headquarters was located. And as soon as we arrived there, we were told we were going to support the 30th Infantry Division up on the northern flank. And that's where Battle Group Kampf Joachim Piper was the spearhead for the German breakthrough, and their target was Antwerp. And the 82nd and the 30th ID really held the northern shoulder. And once that began, and they realized that the German forces, they couldn't move, they began moving further south and ended up with a situation in Bastogne. But my battalion, we went up to the 30th Division, and we were the reserve for the 30th Division because they'd committed all their battalions. And they had Joachim Peiper surrounded on the north, and we were there for, I guess, maybe 2 days, and then we reverted to control of the 82nd Airborne, moved back down into their area, and on the 27th of December, the battalion was tasked to go out and collect information, so we infiltrated out to about 4,000 meters behind the German lines to gather intelligence, and during that night we killed about 100 Germans, took some prisoners, destroyed a half-track, and came back through the line. We lost 1 man that night, and General Gavin was waiting at the outpost and said, "Guys, you did a good job. I'm really proud of you." So that made everybody feel great that he would be there. But that's the way he was. And we then went into rest period until the 3rd of January, and on the 3rd is when the big counterattack was launched by the Allied forces. And the idea there was to push the Germans back east of the Somme River, which would clear them out completely and help straighten the front line. Rather than it being 82nd line like that, it'd be straight, where the Germans having been pushed all the way back. And during that period of time, on the 3rd we suffered a lot of losses, had several officers killed and NCOs, and on the 4th, the morning of the 4th, Lieutenant Durkee had put what was left of A Company back together, which is really about 2 platoons, about 60 men. And as we were moving, he noticed a German machine gun positions that were about to fire on other elements of our battalion, and he ordered the bayonet attack. So my company is the one that conducted one of the rare bayonet attacks during World War II. And during that period, we killed about 84 Germans, or 84 enemy, and destroyed 3 machine guns. And it seemed like it lasted forever, but it wasn't. It was only a few minutes and it was all over. And we then reconstituted the company, reorganized, and moved up to a line overlooking the final objective, which was the Somme River. And we could see, as the train sloped down, we could see down at the bottom is where the river would be, and there was one village there that was fortified. And on the 7th of January, the battalion launched an attack to capture that fortified village, and my company's on the left flank, and we ran into really heavy machine gun fire, and my company commander was killed in just a few minutes from once the attack started, and the rest of A Company was shot up so bad that we had about 6 men left in the company. So Lieutenant Durkee, realizing the situation, ordered the remainder of our walking wounded to move back, and they reported to because at the same time that my company commander was killed, our battalion commander was killed also from artillery fire. And we didn't know that, but the executive officer then ordered A Company to move back into reserve. There's nothing left of A Company, really. And then B and C Company, with a tank that finally showed up, made the final attack on the village, and the Germans surrendered. About 400 that were dug in around that village, and they surrendered because we had the bridge, the only bridge left over the Somme River. We had it cut, so they couldn't escape. So they realized they should go up, and the battalion then, we only had 98 people left in the battalion out of 600 as we went into Belgium. And the General Gavin came down. The company was, the battalion, what was left of it, was moved to Juisselinville, Belgium, for a couple of days of rest. And General Gavin came down and said, "I hate to tell you this, but we don't have replacements to reorganize and reinforce the 551, so it's going to be deactivated. And you guys are all that are still for duty, you're going to be assigned to different regiments in the 82nd Airborne." That ended the life of the 551st there on the 8th of January 1945.
Sir,
And
let's pause right there. We'll take another quick break and come right back on Veterans Chronicles. Our guest today in studio is the retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Dillard, veteran of the 82nd Airborne Division and a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Sir, there's obviously a number of elements about the Battle of the Bulge that have become well known in the 70-plus years since the battle. One is simply the elements, the frigid temperatures. What are your recollections of that?
It was brutal, the weather. And the other thing, which I didn't mention, when we came up from southern France, we still were wearing our summer weight uniforms. Some of us had the woolen shirt and trousers, but you wear that in the summer also. So when we went into the Bulge, we were really not prepared. And again, it was a logistic problem that I think I really fault Eisenhower and Bradley for not having solved that. But the logistics were awful. So I was wearing leather boots and a jumpsuit, and I tried to find some extra, what we call a driver's coat or mechanic coat. It's a 3/4 length coat that's pretty good, pretty warm, and you see an assortment of people with different types of clothing on in order to stay warm. But when we started up there, it was sleeting and snowing, and it continued until the point where we were making those attacks. We were sometime waist deep or at least knee deep in the snow, and the ground was frozen, so you couldn't dig a foxhole. So you just had, if you trying to find some cover, you just try and find tree branches or things of that sort to make a little hutch that you could get under, because you couldn't break the surface of the ground. It was totally frozen, and a lot of people in our unit were affected with trench foot, frostbite, particularly frostbite, and you evacuated, and that was really a bad situation for all the troops that were in the Battle of the Bulge, because they were just logistically were not prepared for it.
And then in terms of the battle itself, the Germans knew this was probably their last best chance to turn the tide of the Western Front in Europe. What did you sense about their desperation, their ferocity as they made their stand there?
In our case, on the 3rd of January, when we started the counterattack, our main opponent was the 63rd Volksgrenadier Division, and they were scattering of 9th SS Panzer support troops in that group, and they felt like they're going to win the battle. And I never saw any desperation on their part. They were there to fight, and they fought, and they fought very honorably. There may be, some instances where a German deserted or indicated that they knew the end was in sight, but I never witnessed any of that. I really didn't. And to give you a good example, Joachim Peiper, who's well known, Colonel Peiper was a super warrior in the German army, and he was leading Comp Group Peiper, which was the lead armored element headed towards Antwerp. And when he got near the village of L'Eglise, the 30th ID on the north stopped him, and the 82nd Airborne, the 504 Parachute Infantry, was on the south, and he got bottled up in L'Eglise, and they had about 1,200 American prisoners there, many of them wounded, and he had his troops, which was around 1,000 German troops, plus armor and other vehicles that just couldn't move because they were running out of fuel, they had technical problems, and they had Americans surrounding them. And yet, Peiper detailed a group to stay there with the vehicles and the artillery, and at a certain time to destroy them, set fire, take the breech blocks out and throw them away. And then he took 700 of his men and actually exfiltrated through, we're not proud of this fact, but they exfiltrated through our lines and got back to the German lines. So, there's absolutely no indication that they were frantic and desperate. They were desperate in fighting to try and make their way to Antwerp, but the spirit was still there.
Quick follow-up on a point you made earlier in our conversation about what it meant to you to have such high praise from General Gavin. Overall, what was your assessment of him as the leader?
During my career of 35 years in the Army, I tried to pattern myself after the examples that I have seen daily with General Gavin and later with General Ridgway. And I always tried to act the way I thought that they would, because they were both troop-oriented. You could never tell where General Gavin's going to show up on the outposts, back on parade, anywhere. And the night that we came back through the lines, he was down there with his aide, but he carried an M1 rifle. And I know that on one occasion he used it when he was surprised by. So that was it was like a traffic jam in Belgium during the Bulge. And one of the people in our company sat down in a fire break to take a smoke, and a guy sat down behind him, and they were back to back. And they smoked a cigarette. When they got through, they got up and looked around, and the other guy was a German. That's how confused things were. So they parted company, one ran one way and one ran the other, but it was really a confused situation for a while because of both U.S. and American stragglers wandering around in those dense woods, forests.
Amazing, amazing. We could spend so much more time on World War II, but let's move to Korea. You decided to stay in the service at the conclusion of World War II, and where did you find yourself when the Korean War broke out?
I was an enlisted man. I was a first sergeant, and I was reassigned to the 82nd, and I got a direct commission at the end of the war as a second lieutenant. And when the Korean War broke out, I was in the 82nd, and we were levied for about 200 officers to go to Korea. And we all went about the same time in the latter part of 50. When my best buddy that had been with me during World War II, he had a childhood friend that was a colonel in MacArthur's headquarters. So when we arrived in Japan, he called him and said, "My mother told me that I should call you and let you know that I'm here," and so forth, and blah, 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 renewing their friendship. And he said, "Where are you guys going?" We said, "I know we're infantry officers. We'll be platoon leaders probably with one of the divisions." And he said, "Well, they're organizing a new unit there, and they need combat experienced parachutists. So would you guys be interested?" And we said, "Well, anything could be better than being an infantry platoon leader." Didn't turn out that way. But we then were picked up from the camp and taken down Tokyo and briefed on the fact we were going into the classified organization that operated behind the lines. And we were to recruit Korean partisans and reinforced by some Chinese that were sent from Taiwan. And when I arrived there, I was the airborne qualified guy, and I took over the airborne operations section, and I trained and dropped agents and partisans all over North Korea and southern Manchuria. And I lost one plane load of people because a Chinese agent had managed to worm his way in the system, and he threw a grenade in the plane as he jumped out and blew it up, and of course that caused the loss of a handful. I had 2 jump masters that were lost, and there were several Chinese agents on board that plane that were also killed. But my buddy he became a logistics officer, but later, a month later, when a quartermaster officer came in, he was reassigned and worked for me as my assistant. And we ran all the airborne operations at night during the moon phase in North Korea. And we did resupply, radio intercept, and agent drops all over North Korea and right on the edge of Manchuria. Around Sevastopol is the Russian port city, and then along the Yalu River. And for a while, a friend of mine volunteered to extend his tour, and he went on leave, and they asked me if I'd go up and run the tactical liaison office with the 1st Marine Division. And I said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to do that." And I went up and took over his team, and what we would do is we had Korean agents in civilian clothes, and we would take them through the front line and we had to work with the Marines there on the outpost line. We'd take them forward to the outpost at a designated location and dispatch them, and they would work their way around in the villages where the Chinese troops were. And they'd stay there 1 or 2 days. On the designated return date, they'd come back to that point. We would meet them and bring them back through the Marine lines. And that was a tactical intelligence. And we had a team with every frontline division that did that. The partisans were principally on the offshore islands on the west coast, from the Yalu River all the way down the through the Hue Hai province, which is right along what is now the DMZ. And we run operations almost every night, landings on the mainland or the peninsula, and do sabotage, try and capture prisoners, disrupt the activities that are going on. And what this did, as a result of this partisan activity on the west coast, the Chinese had to detail a full division, take them away from the front, and put them on that coast to act against the partisan operations. And that was good because it relieved, a certain number of combat troops opposing ours on the front line. And I had many narrow escapes with the drops because we were flying in C-47. And when we got up near Mig Alley, you had to be very, very careful because of the bogies. They would not come down too far in the South Korean area because our Air Forces really shot them up. But they did operate along the Yalu River, so when you're up there at daybreak of the beginning of nautical morning twilight, you had to be really concerned. And the Navy had their night raiders patrolling the area, and it was always good. You stand in the door of the plane and see that Navy jet come up alongside, and the guy wiggle his wings and wave at you. You knew that at least he was there to help protect you in case a North Korean aircraft appeared.
Now, that what you just described was the start of a major shift in your career all the way to your retirement, where military intelligence really became your focal point. You've even been inducted in the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. What about it appealed to you so much?
I guess maybe the potential for intrigue and being able to accomplish something on your own. You're not with with a formation of troops. In Europe, I had the Czech team for a while, and I ran agents myself in Austria and across the German-Czech border and out of Berlin. And it was a sense of personal satisfaction that I was as a Georgia boy with a bad drawl, and I spoke Czech with a Polish accent, one of my agents told me. But I got a lot of satisfaction from being able to do that. And I had to do it on my own. I didn't have anyone out telling me how to do this or covering my back. And in Berlin, they had a warning that the East Germans, and I think the KGB had a reward or a bonus for anyone that could capture one of the American agents and bring him back into the Eastern Zone. And so when we go up there, we then would go in pairs so that we could cover each other, because at night in the safe house there in Berlin, you had to be extremely careful in moving around until you got your agent dispatched, and you go back to the Western Zone. So it was I guess the attraction of the intrigue and the ability to personally do that on your own without being with a formation, as you would be, with a regular airborne infantry unit. And I studied Czech for a year at the Army Language School before I went to Europe. And that was very helpful. But one of my agents did joke about it, and he said, you got the darndest accent. He said, you talk like a Pole when you speak Czech. I said, well, good.
Well, folks are always noticing your accent, probably, right?
Yeah.
Other than the European assignments between Korea and Vietnam, was there anything else you did any other stations you had between Korea and Vietnam?
attended the Army Language School, as I said, and I studied Czech, and I had the Czech team in Europe. And that's an interim period in running operations. I came back and I taught at the intelligence school. Was sent back to Europe, and this time I was on the general staff in Heidelberg in the intelligence division. And I came back to the States on short notice to go to Vietnam. And I ended up, when I arrived in Vietnam, the infamous Phoenix program, which is not infamous for me because we controlled it. But I had the whole Mekong Delta, which is 30% of the population in Vietnam, to work, and I worked under the supervision of the CIA at that time because they were running the program. And the first thing that I did with all this bad publicity that had gone before, I told all of my people, I had about 200 military intelligence officers out in each district in the Delta, and I told them that if I find that you're involved in torture, and I really emphasize this, I will personally see that you're court-martialed. We're not going to do that as long as I'm here, and if I get any indication at all, you'll be relieved. If it confer charges against you, we'll do that. We never had that problem. We did with the Vietnamese every now and then. I remember in Phuong Hep, we went down there and the Vietcong had come in to raid the village, and they captured one of the cadre of the Vietcong, and our advisor was on his way down the canal to take possession of him, and they killed him. So he got down and he said, "Why did you kill him?" And he said, "Well, he wanted to die." And that was it was a really potential good source of information. We didn't want to kill them, we wanted to get the intelligence from them. And there were a lot of them that defected. The Chu Hoi program was pretty good, and they defected, and we recruited people then to work for us, and we had what was known as a province unit of about 100 troops, and most of them were North Vietnamese. And they were light infantry, and they worked in each province. So we would use them out on the different raids and ambush sites that were conducted. But just to give you an idea, the first day I was there for duty, I wanted to go up to the Cambodian border, was the Chau Duc province. So I had my own helicopter, the CIA Air America. So we're flying up there, and we get a Mayday call, and it was an American with an advisor. And he said, "I have a man that stepped on the mine and it blew his leg off, and I can't get the dust off," which is the normal Army evac helicopter. "And I need help." And the pilot said, "Well, it's your plane. What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, we give him help." So we went down and hovered over the paddy, and we got him up and put him in the plane, and there was blood. We splattered all over everybody and in the plane too. I knew he was not going to make it because he'd already turned that color that I've seen so many times. But anyway, we took him back to the village and dropped him off, and later we found out, yeah, he died right away. So I go up to the village in Chau Duc. We're up there about 30 minutes later, and the advisor, my advisor, meets me in a Jeep, and we go out to a little village. He said, "I want to show you something." So we're out there, and there's a young couple. I don't think they'd been married very long. And they had been sympathizers with our advisors. And the Vietcong came in that night and shot them in the air, both of them. And put their bodies on a cart in the middle of the village as a warning, you don't help the Americans. So that was my first day in Vietnam. I thought, what in the devil is going to unfold for this next year? And it was like that off and on, but that made a tremendous impression on me, that the threats that the people that helped us were confronted with the secret army, as they call their guerrilla forces, and the regular Vietcong agents.
Just a couple minutes remaining in our conversation, sir. As you were coordinating attacks on the Vietcong, I believe mostly in the Mekong Delta area, yeah. What was determined to be the Vietcong's greatest vulnerability? What tactics seemed to work most effectively against them?
Number one, working with the villagers to get information. And the other thing was attrition. We did our best to locate them and either get them to join the Chuhoi program as a defector, or we kill them. And the attrition really had an effect because we were very, very active. And we discovered that it was just before I left that there was such a shortage now of volunteers in the Delta for working for the Vietcong that they were sending people down from North Vietnam to replace the people that they couldn't replace locally. So we were on the way to winning that battle against the Vietcong infrastructure. I know in the Delta and up in other areas, I was not that knowledgeable of it, but I know that we were making tremendous success down there among the cadre for the Vietcong. It was our activity influenced people to not readily volunteer to help these people, like collecting taxes or doing sabotage or things of that sort. And many of them then did rally and gave us information about where these cadre were operating. And they were still holdouts. I remember one village that we'd have to fly in like they do in Baghdad these days. I didn't realize that until the other day, but we would fly in and land, and a chopper would immediately take off, and he'd fly away in orbit at 3,000 or 4,000 feet until we had finished our visit. Then we'd radio him to come in, and he would come in just long enough to get on the chopper and get out of there, because the Vietcong were all around that village or hamlet. And that's the way it was, and it could be very dangerous. You could lose the chopper as well as a lot of people.
Last question for you, sir, and I know we've only scratched the surface on your amazing career. What are you most proud of from your time in uniform?
I think I'm really proud of the performance that I saw among our troops. And my battalion commander, whom I alluded to earlier, that was killed, he was a splendid example of, I guess, being a true troop leader. He led from the front, and he was very humane in his attention to the troops and mixing among them like General Gavin. And I just take great pride. When I was in Atlanta last week at the annual Airborne Award ceremony, I saw a lot of my old Airborne friends, and we're just as crazy and wild about supporting the Airborne as we've ever been. But we're very proud of them.
Well, thank you, sir, for your service to our country, and thank you very much for your time today.
Well, I enjoyed it, always do. I like to talk when I have the chance.
Retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Dillard served with the 82nd Airborne Division. He's a veteran of World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. I'm Greg Columbus for Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Columbus, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features. And of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.